The next and final class of submarine built by the Imperial Japanese Navy was the 320 surfaced and 493 submerged ton Ha-201 class, also known as the Sen-Taka-Sho Type. 79 were planned, 22 were started, 10 were completed, none were deployed. This was mostly because they were an emergency 11th hour program. Well, maybe a 10th. In short, they were meant to defend the home islands during the inevitable American invasion by patrolling the coastal waters. As such, they didn't need long range. They also didn't need a large weapons load because they could run out, shoot their shot, and go back to reload. Construction was also quick on these guys. The lessons learned from Germany again showed up. Electric welding was extensively used. They were built in prefabricated sections that were brought together and connected. Combined with their small size, despite constant U.S. bombing, this led to an impressive build rate. The first one sections were brought together and completed in a mere 3 months. Others weren't as quick, but still only took 4 to 5 months. In design, they were essentially mini I-201s. That is to say, they were meant for high submerged speed. Their surface speed was relatively slow compared to other submarines, but submerged, while intended to get up to 19 knots, they could actually only manage about 13. Not racing, but still respectable. They were some of the few submarines during the war that were faster submerged than on the surface. This was accomplished by minimizing deck clutter. They had no large deck gun, only a few machine guns. Cruising speed was of course much lower. Being so small, unlike most submarines of the era, and foreshadowing the future, they had only one propeller. Though this was to speed production more than any type of hydrodynamic efficiency or noise reduction. And they weren't quiet. Like their larger cousins, they also sat relatively low in the water and had a smaller conning tower, making them harder to detect on the surface. A few even had snorkels to allow them to recharge their quickly depleted batteries while submerged. In concept, given the realities of the strategic situation, they weren't too bad an idea. Of course, the biggest problem was they were a sign of how bad the situation was. When it gets so bad, this looks good, maybe it's time to throw in the towel? Japan, however, wasn't ready to do that. By this point, any idea of building an empire to rival the Western powers was gone. All that was left was the commitment to protect the emperor. Not the empire, not Japan, not its people, the emperor. Make no mistake, atomic bombs, the threat of an American invasion, or a Soviet intervention in Manchuria weren't going to convince Japan to surrender. Only, and I mean only, a promise, written or understood, of guaranteeing the emperor's safety was going to convince Japan to surrender. And ultimately, that's what happened. Main armament was 2 bow 533mm tubes for 4 torpedoes. Propulsion on the surface was provided by a diesel engine which produced 400 horsepower that ran the one propeller and recharged the batteries for a surface speed of 10 knots. While submerged, they used their batteries to power one motor which produced 1,250 horsepower for a top speed of 13 knots. Range on the surface was 3,000 nautical miles at 10 knots, and submerged they could do 100 nautical miles at 2 knots. Test diving depth was 100 meters. Again, none ever operationally deployed. Post-war, most of the completed boats were scuttled. There were a few exceptions, though. Ha-209 hit a mine August 13th, was grounded August 18th, then blown up by the U.S. Navy November 11th. Ha-206 sunk August 25th, 1945 in a storm, was raised and scrapped. Perhaps the most tragic was Ha-204. She was sailing on the surface past Hiroshima on the morning of August 6, 1945. When the bomb went off, her bridge crew received a lethal dose of radiation, and several were severely burned. The boat itself was heavily contaminated, and post-war workers were tasked with scrapping the radioactive hulk.